The Americans called it white magic. So many things were appearing, like the telephone, the telegraph. Almost every week a new astounding invention would appear. The one thing that people wanted more than anything else was to be able to capture movement. And so it was like a competition, an Olympic competition. Who was going to get there first? It was very exciting, and yet when it went into the public domain and they built Nickelodeons, it was the working class, the immigrants, that poured into them. And the middle class and upper class tended to. I remember interviewing a woman of 100, and that was in the 90s, and she said she took her courage and took a great deep breath and went to a Nickelodeon. And when she got there, her courage failed her. She had to walk around the building 3 times before she could bring herself to go in. That's how they were regarded. Well, the stigma came about because it was essentially working class entertainment. The theatre was too highly priced, and music or vaudeville, half and half. But motion pictures was, they learnt how to live in America through watching pictures. It was an education as well as an entertainment. Yet you can't imagine the smell. People nowadays wash all the time. They did not in those days, particularly in places where kids would frequent. The ushers used to have to go up and down with spray guns and fire this stuff, this disinfectant, over the audience. And it was for a good reason. They were called flea pits.
Civilians think that animation is about making things move. That's like the first thought. And that's what the first experiments were, by the way. But that's not very interesting. I mean, it's not interesting for very long. And if you think in terms that animation is just a form of storytelling and a form of filmmaking, then to my way of thinking, all the tools of filmmaking and storytelling are relevant and more. And obviously one of those is performance. You know, that ideally the animated creation, however it's done, puppet, drawn, CG, doesn't matter, however it's done, ideally it can perform. You know, and I mean convey emotion, you know, convey ideas. Best of all, I always think, best thing is if you can create the illusion that the puppet's thinking. That's a great thing. So if I want the character to convey thought, an awful lot is done in the eyes. That's a simple practical detail, because the eyes and the eyebrows, this area of the face, so much happens there. The other simple generalism might be to allow time for it. You know, like some forms of animation are all about kinetic action and speed, and that's great. I notice that when the camera and the character are moving very fast, you may be having a lot of fun, it may be a great ride, but you don't know what anyone's thinking at any stage except probably, ah! You get that quite a lot. But if you want to convey thought, leave some screen time for it, you know, as you do in live action. And recently we've had an experience of making a more or less silent film, Shaun the Sheep, the movie, which doesn't use dialogue at all. The characters either grunt or bleat, so there is no dialogue. In fact, it's actually more silent than the average silent film, because there's no intertitles either to tell you what anyone's saying. We did encourage the animators, directors and storyboard artists to look at silent comedy for inspiration. And why? Because the best of those guys, the famous ones, you know, Chaplin and Lloyd and Keaton and Laurel and Hardy, the best of them rose to the top in their field by being the best and had a brilliant instinct for comedy. Comedy, micro and macro scale, you know, a great instinct for the funny close-up that sometimes says it all, great instinct for the set piece, you know, the great elaborate comedy set piece. So they were so good at it that in a way we'd be fools not to look at them and you know, not copy them, of course, but look at them, see what they did, see how they played the gag, and use that. And the obvious thing to say now is that because people don't do that anymore, because they're not required to, that is a skill which has been largely lost, I think. You know, I don't mean irreparably lost, but that skill used to be in the air. Like lots of people thought in terms of visual comedy, and now they don't so much.
There's a Felix the Cat cartoon in 1922 called Felix Turns the Tide, where a World War I-like conflict between cats and rats that in many ways resembled a full-scale war. When rats declare war, humans don't fight against them, but Felix bravely leaves his owner to join the battle at the front. Otto Messmer, as director, was not shy to show huge waves of cats being blown through the air and killed by the rats' ammunition. He worked very hard to show that even if the cartoon on many levels was funny, war was hell.
I met Otto Messmer, this would have been in 1980, 81. He was still old, but pretty sharp, and I interviewed him. He was a very congenial, gentle guy. Messmer had a very sort of inspiring way about speaking about the character. He would talk about, you know, how the structure of the films was about, you know, the search and the yearning for something, and you could tell that he was really very connected to this character still all these decades later. It really meant a lot to him that he had sort of been rediscovered and his films had been rediscovered.
So another really interesting pioneer is Starevich, Ladislas Starevich, who I think was Polish, lived and worked in Russia, most of his working life in France. And he apparently started out as an entomologist. And I think the story is he wanted to film stag beetles fighting. And either they couldn't or else they cook under lights. I don't know what the problem was, but he couldn't get the shot. And so he took a stag beetle, which lends itself to animation very well because it's made of like a suit of armour, jointed parts, you know, killed it, I suppose, inserted copper wire or something in there, and animated the stag beetles fighting. So he got his natural history footage in this completely bogus way, and then thought, oh, this is fun, and set off on a career.
Well, Hearst was obviously one of the most powerful newspaper figures in America, a real advocate of visuals in his newspapers. He basically underwrote the early history of comic strips in America. His animation studio is basically, you know, I believe run at a loss to sort of promote his characters that were running in virtually every American, you know, Sunday supplement all over the country. Some of the Hearst characters would be the Cats and Jammer Kids, Happy Hooligan, Bringing Up Father. These were incredibly well-known characters to, you know, any American audience.
I basically, as a kid, was a big fan of the comic strip Crazy Cat because of the artistic style from George Harriman. Also, I was a big fan of the theatrical shorts dating from the 1910s up until like the early 1960s. I've always had a fascination with the silent ones. Even though that they were not really loyal in concept and design of the original comic strip, most particularly ones I like are from the mid-20s, from Bill Nolan from 1925. When he was about to start off as an independent producer, he was looking for a character to start a new cartoon series. So he basically decided to do Crazy Cat because he was familiar with the character, because he animated for the Hearst Studios back in the mid-1910s. With that being said, he made a few minor changes to the character. For starters, in the comic strip, Crazy was actually a female who was in love with a mouse. Nolan decided to change things and make Crazy into a full-fledged male. The only problem with these films is that most of the films are lost. The producer of the films, Margaret Winkler, back in the late 1940s, decided, because she could no longer afford the storage space, decided to destroy all the original Nitrate negatives.
She destroyed hundreds of master copies of the silent Disney cartoons and the silent Fleischer cartoons and the silent Crazy Cat cartoons, many of which are lost films today.
Now, Bray, as we know, is a very enterprising man. He was always looking for ways to monetize the films that he had produced and that he'd saved in his archive. One of the things Bray did in the early 1920s was create the Brayco film strip projector. It's a portable viewer for the film strips. And if I can open this, you would put the strip in one side and this rubber roller here would move it to the other side so you could look through and watch it. Now what Bray did exactly was he took films that he'd already produced and made these film strip versions of them. He would take maybe one image per scene and an intertitle and come up with an extremely shortened version that you could watch in still form. I don't know of many people who have really gone out and collected these specifically, but I'm sure there's some out there which might be the only records of these films for now. Starting mostly in the 1930s, there were many companies that came along and took films that were floating around and made their own, usually edited copies of them. In our view, these are important films, but they were really marketed as toys. So they were really intended to amuse kids or families, but they were also being sold with projectors that were designed sort of as meat grinders. So a lot of times these films would simply get run through the mill and destroyed in many cases. In the early 1930s, the Keystone Company, not the film production studio, but this toy manufacturer and film projector manufacturer, bought several dozen negatives from the Bray studios. And here are some examples of the 16mm boxes that they had at the time. So in 1932, Keystone purchased these negatives from Bray, and in many cases, the Keystone prints are currently the only versions of these films that survive. In the late 1940s, when Bray was preparing his television package, he went back to Keystone and wanted to purchase back these negatives. In some cases, they were already deteriorated by then. Eventually, by the 1940s and 50s, we come to 8mm. 8mm has the potential of providing us with things that might still be rare, but it is such a reduced picture quality. It's only a quarter of the 16mm picture quality, which is a quarter of the 35mm picture quality. So between reducing the image so many times and also reprinting the films, we come out with pretty low quality copies. But this kind of toy film business was revived a bit again because of 8mm. So even into the 60s, we have examples of prints like this of silent cartoons such as Crazy Cat, or in this case, a new creation, Kitty Cat. This company here would take any silent cartoon with a cat and call it Kitty Cat. So it was a genius branding moment. All of these products here were very far removed from the original producers and especially the animators. So I imagine they had little to no say in the production of these prints, but I bet there were some old animators and maybe even producers who would walk into a drugstore and see something like this on the shelf and scratch their head. Nitrate film is composed of something similar to gunpowder. The chemical makeup is basically an explosive. So over time, if the film is exposed to heat or if it's stored poorly, it will melt or turn to goo, or under the right circumstances, if there's a fire, it will just explode and cause a very bad situation.